He was surrounded. 12 German machine guns trained on his position, the closest barely 50 feet away, bleeding from shrapnel wounds, alone on an Italian mountainside in the pre-dawn darkness of March 12, 1945. And it all began with a simple order. Take Monte Belvedere. A Brazilian lieutenant named Marcos Eduardo Vargas did what nobody thought possible. He crossed a minefield nobody had mapped under a curtain of machine gun fire, mortars, and artillery. Reached the summit, seized the position, took 7 German prisoners with his own hands. But when night fell, the Germans realized there was only one man defending that mountain, and they decided they needed to remove that man from there. 4 times the Germans counterattacked. 4 times he repelled them. Wounded, surrounded, without reinforcements, without possibility of evacuation, while artillery fell like rain from hell. Marcos Eduardo Vargas spent 15 hours, 15 entire hours on that mountain, holding that position with his own hands, his courage, and his refusal to surrender. And when the night finally ended, when he was finally evacuated, the world knew. Radio Broadcasting Corporation of London transmitted his story. The Americans did the impossible, gave Marcos Eduardo Vargas the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest military decoration of the United States. One of only 3 Brazilians to ever receive that medal. But when he returned to Brazil, the country forgot him completely. The newspapers didn't mention it. History books didn't tell it. Brazilians never knew the name of the man who alone on an Italian mountain defeated the German army. If you want to know this true story, subscribe to the channel now, turn on notifications, and comment which city and state you're watching us from. To understand who Marcos Eduardo Vargas was, you need to dive into Brazil of 1921. Back then, there were worlds within worlds. There was the Brazil of dirt roads, of coffee plantations, of favelas growing like mushrooms on the hillsides of Porto Alegre. And there was the Brazil of emerging middle classes, of liberal professionals, of men who had studied and believed that knowledge transcended the limitations of reality. Marcos Eduardo Vargas was born into the second Brazil, the Brazil of possibilities. Born on March 17, 1921, in Porto Alegre. Son of a man who built an entire life from nothing. His father, engineer Eduardo Vargas Santos, was a man of multiple professions: civil engineer, surveyor, construction manager. He didn't specialize in just one thing. He mastered several disciplines, built something from nothing, organized chaos, transformed knowledge into action. And Marcos, growing up under that influence, absorbed not just the discipline, but the philosophy that sustained it. The world is not something you endure, it's something you shape. When Marcos reached the age to study, he was sent to Colegio Julio de Castilhos, the most prestigious institution in southern Brazil at the time. There he learned not just mathematics and physics, but also the language of power. He learned how men of influence move. He understood that structures could be manipulated through education. He studied civil engineering after leaving school, delved deep into structural mechanics. He was a young man destined for a successful career in the private sector, a life of blueprints, calculations, and predictable security. But in 1939, when the world began to collapse, when World War II started in Europe with the invasion of Poland, when radios transmitted news of destruction across entire cities, when it became clear that no place would be safe from a conflict of that magnitude, something changed fundamentally in Marcos. There was no record of when exactly this transformation occurred, but at some point the young engineer understood there was something more important than blueprints. There was duty, there was honor, there was sacrifice, and Marcos made a choice that would change everything. He presented himself to the Reserve Officers Preparation Center. This center was a unique place in Brazil, a space where civilians could become military officers without making a permanent career in the institution. A place where education met discipline, a space where men like Marcos could discover a version of themselves they perhaps didn't even know existed. Marcos was accepted. And when the tests came, when the evaluators analyzed the candidates of 1940, when they made their assessments of who would be capable of leading men in combat, Marcos ranked 7th among 83 graduates. 7th place. That meant only 6 men were better than him. It meant there was something fundamental in Marcos that transcended training, innate leadership, that indefinable quality that makes men follow you even when you ask them to do things that could kill them. After his graduation, Marcos was assigned to the 3rd Infantry Regiment as a second lieutenant. For 4 years, he spent his days in a Brazil that slowly prepared for the war it knew would come. He saw recruits arrive from across the country, be intensively trained, depart. He spent years observing, learning, understanding the nature of conflict. There was confrontation everywhere, in politics, in the streets, in military institutions. Marcus learned to read these conflicts, understand their underlying dynamics, predict where they would evolve. In August 1944, when the call came, when they told him he would be sent to Italy as part of the second echelon of the Brazilian Expeditionary Force, Marcus didn't hesitate, didn't question, simply departed. He had learned that hesitation is death disguised, that doubt is postponement of action, that courage is refusal to accept that things cannot be done. The journey to Italy lasted weeks. The ships traversed the Atlantic under constant risk of German torpedoes. There were frequent alarms. There were nights when men were awakened with instructions to evacuate the ship. There were men who had never seen the ocean now sleeping in holds that smelled of sweat, fear, and despair. The air was so stale that breathing seemed like a task in itself. Food was rationed and inadequate. Marcus, as an officer, had better accommodations. A cabin instead of a bunk in a hold. But even so, there was constant tension. Death could come at any moment in the form of a torpedo, interrupting the journey. When he arrived in Italy in September 1944, Marcus found a theater of war completely different from anything imagined from radio reports or newspapers. It wasn't Hollywood cinema. It wasn't the glory the posters promised. It was mud. It was cold. It was death in forms no human being should witness. The Italian winter of 1944 to 1945 was one of the most severe in decades. The temperature dropped to 30 below zero on the worst days. Snow fell for days on end, until you couldn't distinguish ground from sky. Men froze in their trenches because Brazilian clothes designed for tropical heat weren't made for Arctic climate. The environment breathed pure and simple death, literally. There were frozen corpses lying on the ground, waiting for burial when spring arrived. There were amputations caused by frostbite, toes that turned black and had to be removed to prevent gangrene. There were men who simply gave up living because the cold seemed stronger than the will to resist. There were suicides, there was madness, and in this infernal reality, in this cold that seemed never to end, in this war that seemed senseless, Marcus Eduardo Vargas discovered who he really was. It wasn't about an engineer, not a young man from the middle class of Porto Alegre who had studied at an elite school, not a man who would spend his life working with blueprints. It was about a soldier, a leader, a man capable of leading others through hell, a man capable of making decisions that meant life and death, a man capable of maintaining calm when everything around him crumbled, a man capable of looking at death and refusing to accept its inevitability. The first proof of his courage came in January 1945, in the Serchio Valley. The natural valley stretched through the Apennine Mountains like a knife wound in flesh. It constituted a fundamental position because whoever controlled it controlled access to the entire northern region. The objective had been disputed for months between Brazilians, Americans, and Germans. So many died there that the ground was covered with frozen blood. The bodies of those who fell in previous weeks were still there frozen, forming a macabre carpet. The Germans controlled the position. The Allies, Americans, and Brazilians needed it, and the Brazilian Expeditionary Force was sent to take the valley. Marcus commanded his platoon as if he had already been born for it. There was no hesitation in his movements. He moved his men through machine gun fire with almost surreal calm. He didn't shout, didn't gesture unnecessarily, simply led. And his men followed him, because there was something in the way Marcus moved, how he gave orders, how he looked at the enemy even under heavy fire, that communicated absolute certainty. He knew what he was doing, wouldn't lead them to death without reason. He understood war in a way most men would never comprehend. It was as if he could see through the fog of battle, understand enemy movements before they happened, anticipate the consequences of each action. The Serchio Valley fell, the Brazilians took the position, and Marcus, who had demonstrated exceptional bravery, who had kept his platoon alive in a situation where practically everyone should have been dead, received the Silver Star from the Americans. It was recognition of the highest level. It was validation that everything he had done was correct. It was confirmation that he wasn't just an ordinary soldier, but an extraordinary leader. But Marcus didn't celebrate much. He knew there was more. He knew the war hadn't ended. He knew there were other mountains, there were other positions, there were other opportunities. And then came March 1945. Came the winter that seemed it would never end. Came the order that would change everything. Take Monte Belvedere. Monte Belvedere was a massive elevation, strategically critical when viewed from the overall strategic perspective. It was taller than previous objectives, but it was the key. It was the type of position that, if the Germans maintained it, could jeopardize the entire Allied strategy in that sector. And after the proof in Serchio Valley, after his demonstration of exceptional leadership, the command chose Marcus to conquer Monte Belvedere. The night of March 11, 1945, was particularly cold. The temperature had dropped below 25 degrees negative. A blizzard made visibility practically zero. You couldn't see 10 feet ahead. The world had shrunk to only what was immediately around you. Sounds were muffled. Screams seemed distant even when close. Marcus gathered his men and explained the mission with the precision of someone who had done this before. There was a minefield, unmapped between them and the target. Nobody knew the exact location of the mines. There were German machine guns positioned at key points. There was artillery that could fall at any moment. The objective was to conquer the position, reach the summit, assume control, take prisoners if possible, and maintain the position until reinforcements arrived. It seemed impossible. It probably was impossible, but Marcus was accustomed to the impossible. War isn't made of mathematical possibilities. It's made of moments of decision where you choose to act or fail. And Marcus always chose to act. He gathered his men, 90, maybe 100. The numbers vary in reports. But everyone agrees there was a cohesive group of Brazilians waiting for the order. Men who knew Marcus, men who had fought with him in Serchio Valley, men who trusted he would take them where necessary. 400 meters separated their trenches from the goal. 400 meters of open terrain mined under artillery fire. 400 meters that represented an eternity at combat speed. Marcus looked at his men, saw the fear in their eyes, saw the resignation, saw men who expected to die, and then said the words that would change everything. Let's go. It wasn't a shout. It wasn't an inspiring speech. It was a simple word that communicated pure action. The steps in the snow made noise. Each one was a scream that told the Germans, "Here comes the enemy." And the Germans responded. The machine guns fired. The sound was incessant, deafening, as if reality itself was tearing to pieces. It was a sound you didn't just hear. It was a sound you felt in your bones, that vibrated in your chest, that made your heart beat out of rhythm. Bullets cut through the air. The snow turned red where men fell. Marcus's companions began to fall. Some screamed, others disappeared into the red snow, and Marcus kept walking, kept leading, kept advancing as if he knew every step. Adrenaline made Marcus make decisions that saved lives. Disperse, move in zigzag patterns, don't run in straight lines. Even under direct fire, Marcus was thinking, was analyzing, was saving lives through his tactical intelligence. The final 100 meters was the most terrible. The concentration of German fire increased exponentially. Bullets ricocheted, mortars exploded, the earth convulsed, men fell every second. There was blood in the snow, there were screams, there was the particular smell of death, and still they advanced because the alternative was certain death. And then they reached the summit. Monte Belvedere had been conquered. The Brazilian flag was planted in the ruins. Marcus, with blood streaming down his body, with wounds that should have killed him, looked at his men. He saw 7 German prisoners, 7 men, kneeling, disarmed, defeated. But Monte Belvedere didn't represent victory. It represented a trap. The Germans were regrouping. Marcus was isolated and wounded. About an hour later, the first counterattacks began. The Germans descended from the snow in coordinated waves, and Marcus, wounded and surrounded, had to make a choice, retreat or resist. But Marcus didn't retreat. His men were there. The order was to maintain Monte Belvedere. So Marcus, wounded, bleeding, in shock from blood loss, prepared his men to defend. The first counterattack came at 11:47 at night. Marcus could hear them before he could see them. The snow muffled their footsteps, but there was something else, something primal, that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. The Germans were coming, and they were coming in force. Marcus positioned his men with surgical precision. Each soldier knew exactly where to aim, exactly when to fire. This wasn't about quantity of bullets. It was about selection of targets. It was about making every single round count, Because they didn't have unlimited ammunition, didn't have unlimited time, didn't have unlimited lives. Marcus conducted the defensive fire like a maestro conducts an orchestra. He moved between positions, correcting angles, encouraging men, maintaining absolute composure even as the world exploded around him. The Germans came in waves, disciplined, coordinated, professional soldiers who knew exactly what they were doing. But they hadn't counted on Marcus Eduardo Vargas. Sergeant Paulo Medeiros, known to his men as Lobo because of his predatory instinct in combat, anchored the left flank. He was 31 years old, had been fighting since the landing, had seen more death than any man should witness in 10 lifetimes, but even Lobo had never seen anything like what Marcus was doing. The lieutenant was everywhere at once, moving through gunfire like it didn't exist, dragging wounded men to cover, redistributing ammunition, calling in coordinates for artillery support that never came. The radio was dead. Corporal Rafael Santos had taken shrapnel to his chest during the initial assault, and the radio had been destroyed with him. They were completely cut off from command. Nobody knew they had taken Monte Belvedere. Nobody knew they were surrounded. Nobody was coming to save them. Private Juan Henrique Costa was 19 years old. He had lied about his age to enlist, told the recruitment officer he was 21. He wanted to serve, wanted to prove himself, wanted to be part of something larger than his small life in Recife. Now he was pressed against frozen earth, firing his rifle at shadows that materialized out of the snow, watching men he had shared meals with die in ways that would haunt him forever, if he survived long enough to remember. His hands shook so badly he could barely reload. But every time panic threatened to overwhelm him, every time he thought about running, about surrendering, about just closing his eyes and letting it end, he looked at Lieutenant Vargas, and the lieutenant was calm. The lieutenant was focused. The lieutenant acted like they were going to win this, like survival was not just possible, but inevitable. And somehow, impossibly, João believed him. The Germans withdrew after the first assault. Marcus counted the cost. 3 dead, 7 wounded, 2 critically. They had started with 93 men. Now they had 83 combat-effective soldiers, and that number would only decrease. He moved among the wounded, checking their conditions, redistributing medical supplies that were already critically low. Private Tomás Ribeiro had taken a bullet through his leg, the bone shattered, and he was going into shock. Marcus gave him his own morphine injection, the last one he carried, and told him lies. Told him reinforcements were coming, told him medics would arrive soon, told him everything would be fine. Thomas believed him because soldiers believe what they need to believe to keep fighting. The temperature continued to drop. It was now somewhere around 32 degrees below zero. The kind of cold that makes metal stick to skin, that makes breathing painful, that kills as efficiently as bullets. Marcus's wounds from the initial assault were getting worse. The shrapnel in his shoulder blade ground against bone every time he moved, sending lightning bolts of agony through his nervous system. Blood had soaked through his uniform, freezing against his skin, but he couldn't stop moving. The moment he stopped, the moment he showed weakness, his men would break. Leadership in combat isn't about speeches or inspiration. It's about demonstrating through action that survival is possible. It's about being the living proof that death is not inevitable. At 1:17 in the morning, the second counterattack came. This time, the Germans were smarter, more cautious. They had learned from the first assault that frontal attacks wouldn't work. So they tried infiltration, small groups moving through the rocks and snow, trying to get behind Brazilian positions, trying to surround individual foxholes and overwhelm them with grenades and close-quarters combat. Marcus anticipated this. He had repositioned men after the first assault, creating overlapping fields of fire, ensuring that every approach was covered. When the Germans tried to infiltrate, they walked into a meat grinder. But the fighting was closer now, more personal. Marcus found himself in hand-to-hand combat with a German sergeant who materialized out of the darkness. The man was enormous, probably 6'4", heavily muscled, trained in combat techniques Marcus had only read about. They grappled in the snow, both trying to gain advantage, both knowing that the loser would die. Marcus's engineering education saved his life. He understood leverage, understood angles, understood how to use an opponent's weight against him. When the German lunged, Marcus stepped aside and used the momentum to send him tumbling over the edge of a rocky outcrop. The man screamed for 3 seconds before the impact silenced him. Marcus didn't have time to think about what he had just done, didn't have time to process that he had just killed a man with his bare hands. There were more Germans coming, and his men needed him. Sergeant Medeiros appeared beside him, face covered in blood from a scalp wound that looked worse than it was. The sergeant was grinning, actually grinning, with that particular madness that overtakes men in combat when fear transforms into something else entirely. They killed 6 more Germans together before the attack broke, and the enemy withdrew again. Now they had 78 men, 15 dead, 11 wounded. The defensive perimeter was shrinking because they didn't have enough bodies to hold the entire summit. Marcus made the brutal calculation that every commander makes in combat. He consolidated his forces, abandoned the outermost positions, pulled everyone back to a tighter circle that they could actually defend. This meant leaving wounded men in exposed positions, men who couldn't be moved without killing them. Marcus went to each one personally, gave them grenades, told them they could surrender if they wanted to. Every single one refused. Every single one said they would hold their position as long as they could. These men, these ordinary Brazilians who had been farmers and mechanics and shopkeepers just months before, chose to face death alone rather than compromise the defense. The snow had turned red. Everywhere Marcus looked, there was blood. Brazilian blood, German blood. It all looked the same in the moonlight. The 7 German prisoners he had taken during the initial assault were huddled in a depression in the center of the defensive perimeter. They were terrified, certain they would be executed. In the chaos of battle, it would have been easy. It would have been efficient. It would have freed up the 2 men guarding them. But Marcus ordered his soldiers to share water with the prisoners, to give them blankets, to treat their wounded. Because in the middle of hell, in the middle of senseless violence, maintaining humanity was the only thing that separated soldiers from murderers. At 3:41 in the morning, a German artillery barrage began. This wasn't the sporadic fire they had experienced before. This was systematic, coordinated, overwhelming. The Germans had brought up their heavy guns, and they were going to obliterate Monte Belvedere, even if it meant killing their own men who might still be on the slopes. The world became noise and concussion and flying rock fragments. Men died without being shot, killed by pressure waves that liquefied internal organs. Men went mad, screaming and trying to run until their own comrades had to physically restrain them. Marcus moved through the bombardment like he was taking a walk in a park. He checked positions, redistributed ammunition one more time, pulled wounded men deeper into cover, maintained the organization that was the only thing keeping them alive. Private Costa watched the lieutenant and understood something fundamental about courage. It wasn't about not being afraid. The lieutenant was terrified. Costa could see it in his eyes during the brief moments when his guard dropped. But the lieutenant had made a choice that fear would not control his actions, had decided that duty and honor and the lives of his men were more important than the screaming instinct to survive. And that choice, repeated every second, in every action, was transforming Lieutenant Marcus Eduardo Vargas from a man into a legend. The third counterattack came during the artillery barrage. The Germans used their own fire as cover, advancing through the explosions, betting that the Brazilians would be too disorganized to respond effectively. It almost worked. Almost. But Marcus had anticipated even this, had positioned men specifically to watch for infantry movement during bombardment, had created rally points where soldiers could regroup if positions were overrun. When the Germans emerged from the smoke and chaos, they found Brazilians waiting for them. The fighting was apocalyptic. There were no tactics anymore, no strategy, just desperate men trying to kill each other in the most efficient ways possible. Marcus emptied his pistol into attacking Germans, then grabbed a rifle from a dead soldier. Then, when that ran out of ammunition, grabbed another. Sergeant Medeiros died during the third assault. A German stick grenade landed in his foxhole, and he threw himself on top of it. The explosion was muffled by his body, contained enough that the 3 soldiers sharing the position survived. Marcus saw it happen, saw his friend sacrifice himself, saw another piece of his soul die. But there was no time to mourn. The dead had no needs. The living did. He pulled the survivors out of the foxhole, repositioned them, and kept fighting. The Germans withdrew for the third time. Now the Brazilians had 61 combat-effective soldiers, 32 dead, 14 wounded. They had been on Monte Belvedere for 11 hours. At 5:18 in the morning, as the first grey light of dawn began to illuminate the mountain, the fourth and final counterattack began. The Germans committed everything they had left. This wasn't about tactics anymore, this was about pride. They could not accept that a single Brazilian lieutenant and his platoon had defeated them, had held a position that should have been overrun hours ago. So they came in force, officers leading from the front, soldiers following with the kind of fanaticism that ideology creates. Marcus gathered his remaining men and told them the truth. This was it. This was the last fight. Either they held now or they died trying. There would be no retreat, no surrender, no escape. Every man understood. Every man accepted. And when the Germans came, the Brazilians met them with a fury that transcended training, transcended discipline, transcended everything except raw human will to survive. The battle lasted 47 minutes. When it ended, when the Germans finally broke and retreated down the mountain, when the shooting stopped and the only sounds were the moans of the wounded and the whistle of wind through rocks, Marcus Eduardo Vargas collapsed. The blood loss finally caught up with him. The adrenaline that had kept him functioning drained away. He fell to his knees in the red snow and for the first time in 15 hours allowed himself to feel pain. And then he heard it. The sound of American artillery firing from the valley below. The sound of engines as reinforcement vehicles made their way up the mountain road. The sound of rescue. They had survived. They had won. If this story moved you, if you believe that courage like this deserves to be remembered, subscribe to this channel now and turn on notifications so you never miss the stories of forgotten heroes. Comment below and tell us what you learned from Lieutenant Vargas's incredible stand. Share your thoughts on what true leadership means in impossible situations. And most importantly, tell us where you're watching from, what city, what state, what country, because these stories belong to everyone who believes that honor and sacrifice should never be forgotten. They carried Marcus Eduardo Vargas down the mountain on a stretcher that required 8 men to manage across the treacherous terrain. He drifted in and out of consciousness. The morphine the American medics had given him, creating strange dreams where the living and the dead moved together through landscapes of fire and ice. In his delirium, he saw Sergeant Medeiros standing beside him, grinning that insane grin, telling him the boys would be fine, telling him the mission was complete. Then he would wake to excruciating pain and remember that Lobo was dead, that 32 men who had followed him up that mountain would never come down. The field hospital was organized chaos. Doctors moved between tables performing triage with brutal efficiency. Men screamed, men died. Men waited their turn with the patience of those who understand that suffering is simply another form of duty. When they brought Marcus in, covered in blood, shaking from hypothermia and shock, a surgeon took one look at him and called for immediate intervention. The shrapnel wounds were infected. He had lost catastrophic amounts of blood. His core temperature was dangerously low. By any reasonable medical assessment, Lieutenant Marcus Eduardo Vargas should have been dead hours ago. But Marcus Eduardo Vargas was not a reasonable man. While surgeons worked to extract metal fragments embedded in bone, while nurses fought to bring his body temperature back to survivable levels, while blood transfusions poured into his veins, Marcus maintained consciousness long enough to ask 3 questions. How many of my men survived? Where are the German prisoners? Did we hold Monte Belvedere? The answers came from Captain Alberto Ferreira, who had arrived with the relief force. 61 men survived out of 93. The German prisoners were being processed and would receive medical treatment. Monte Belvedere remained in Brazilian hands, and because of that position, the entire Allied advance in that sector had become possible. Marcus nodded once, satisfied, and finally allowed himself to surrender to unconsciousness. He would sleep for 18 hours straight. While Marcus fought for his life in the hospital, the story of Monte Belvedere was already spreading. Combat correspondents attached to the American Fifth Army had witnessed the aftermath, had seen the bodies covering the mountainside, had counted the evidence of 4 separate German counterattacks, had interviewed the survivors who spoke with reverence about their lieutenant who had refused to accept defeat. The story reached Radio Broadcasting Corporation of London. A Brazilian lieutenant named Marcus Eduardo Vargas, they reported, had achieved one of the most remarkable defensive actions of the Italian campaign, holding a strategic position for 15 hours against overwhelming German forces, repelling 4 major counterattacks, and doing so with minimal casualties considering the circumstances. The broadcast reached Brazil. For a brief moment, the country paid attention. Newspapers ran headlines about the heroic Brazilian officer in Italy. Radio programs dedicated segments to his story. Parents of soldiers fighting in Europe allowed themselves to feel pride instead of just fear. Marcos Eduardo Vargas became, for exactly 3 weeks, a national hero. And then, the censorship began. The military government of Getulio Vargas had complicated relationships with the stories emerging from Italy. Some stories were useful for propaganda, demonstrating Brazilian military prowess, encouraging continued support for the war effort. Other stories were dangerous, creating individual heroes whose popularity might become politically problematic, raising questions about why these men were fighting in Europe while Brazil struggled with internal challenges. The decision came from somewhere high in the Ministry of War. A classified notice circulated to newspaper editors and radio station managers. Coverage of individual military actions without official authorization was forbidden. Interviews with returning soldiers required prior approval. Stories that created personality cults around individual officers were discouraged. The message was clear, even if never explicitly stated. Stop talking about Marcos Eduardo Vargas, and Brazil, obedient as always to authority, stopped talking. By the time Marcos was healthy enough to return to active duty, the newspapers had moved on to other topics. By the time the war ended and the Brazilian Expeditionary Force returned home, his name had already faded from public memory. Marcos spent 3 weeks recovering in the field hospital before doctors cleared him for light duty. The wounds healed, leaving scars that would ache in cold weather for the rest of his life. But the psychological wounds went deeper. He had led 93 men up a mountain. 32 had died following his orders. In quiet moments when sleep wouldn't come, Marcos would run through the battle again in his mind, analyzing every decision, wondering if he could have done something differently, questioning whether their deaths had been necessary. The rational part of his mind understood that his actions had been correct, that more men would have died if he had made different choices, that the position had to be held, and was held. But rationality provides poor comfort when you remember the faces of the dead. On April 3, 1945, Marcos Eduardo Vargas received the Distinguished Service Cross from the American Command. The citation read in part, "For extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations against an armed enemy, Lieutenant Vargas displayed exceptional courage, tactical brilliance and inspirational leadership during the defense of Monte Belvedere. Despite severe wounds and being surrounded by enemy forces, he maintained his position for 15 hours, repelling 4 major counterattacks and preserving a strategically vital position. His actions exemplify the highest traditions of military service and reflect great credit upon himself, the Brazilian Expeditionary Force and the Allied cause." It was one of only 3 times the United States awarded their second highest combat decoration to Brazilian soldiers. The ceremony was brief and professional. Generals made speeches about Allied cooperation and shared sacrifice. Photographers took pictures that would appear in military journals and then be forgotten. Marcos stood at attention, accepted the medal, saluted, and walked away. The medal meant nothing to him. The 32 dead men meant everything. When the war ended in May 1945, the Brazilian Expeditionary Force began the long process of demobilization and return home. Marcos sailed back to Brazil in June, standing at the rail of the transport ship watching the coast of Italy disappear, wondering if any of it had mattered. The answer would take decades to reveal itself. He returned to Porto Alegre in July 1945, to a city that had moved on. There were no parades for individual soldiers, no celebrations for specific heroes. The Brazilian Expeditionary Force received a collective acknowledgement and was then expected to reintegrate into civilian society as quickly and quietly as possible. Marcos returned to his engineering career, working on construction projects, designing buildings, transforming the skills he had learned before the war into a productive peacetime life. He married Ana Clara Fernandes in 1947. They had 3 children, Miguel, Lucia, and Renata. He became a respected professional, a good father, a pillar of his community, and he never talked about the war. His children grew up knowing their father had fought in Italy, but the details remained locked away. When they asked questions, Marcos would give minimal answers and change the subject. When they found his medals in a drawer and asked what they meant, he told them they were just pieces of metal from a long time ago. The silence wasn't about modesty or humility. It was about protection. Protection for his children from the nightmares that still woke him in the middle of the night. Protection for himself from memories that had never really healed. Protection from a country that had decided his sacrifice was better forgotten than celebrated. The years passed. The 1950s became the 1960s, became the 1970s. Brazil changed governments, changed economies, changed its entire relationship with its own history. The Brazilian Expeditionary Force became a footnote in textbooks, mentioned briefly and then moved past. The individual soldiers who had fought became anonymous, their specific stories lost to bureaucratic indifference and deliberate forgetting. Marcos Eduardo Vargas retired from engineering in 1982. He was 61 years old, had built a successful career, had raised a family, had lived what anyone would consider a good life. But there was an emptiness that nothing filled, a sense that something profoundly important had been erased. In 1995, 50 years after Monte Belvedere, Marcos attended a reunion of Brazilian Expeditionary Force veterans in São Paulo. There were fewer than 200 men present, survivors of the 15,000 who had fought in Italy. They were old now, in their 70s and 80s, bodies failing, but memories sharp as broken glass. Marcos sat in a conference hall surrounded by men who understood, men who had seen the same things, lost the same friends, carried the same scars. And for the first time in 5 decades, he talked about the war. He talked about Sergeant Medeiros throwing himself on a grenade. He talked about Private Costa, who survived the battle and became a teacher in Recife, dedicating his life to educating children about courage and sacrifice. He talked about the 32 men who died on that mountain, whose names nobody remembered, whose families received letters of condolence and nothing more. An historian attending the reunion recognized Marcos's name from old military records. She approached him after his informal testimony, asked if he would be willing to be interviewed for a research project on the Brazilian Expeditionary Force. Marcos agreed. The interview lasted 6 hours. He told her everything, every detail he could remember, every decision he had made, every face of the men who had died. The historian recorded it all, transcribed it, incorporated it into her doctoral dissertation that approximately 47 people would eventually read. The story of Marcos Eduardo Vargas had been preserved, but it remained hidden in academic archives, unknown to the broader public that should have known it all along. Marcos Eduardo Vargas died on September 14, 2003, at the age of 82. He died in a hospital in Porto Alegre, surrounded by his children and grandchildren, at peace with a life well lived but haunted until the end by the men who hadn't made it home. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned that he was a veteran of World War II, mentioned that he had received American decorations for valor, and devoted most of its space to his engineering career and community service. There was no mention of Monte Belvedere, no mention of 15 hours, no mention of the impossible thing he had done on a frozen mountain in Italy when he was 24 years old. But here's what matters. Here's why you're watching this video 80 years after the battle. Because the truth doesn't die just because people stop telling it. Because courage doesn't become less real just because governments decide to forget it. Because the story of Marcos Eduardo Vargas and the 93 men who climbed Monte Belvedere belongs not to politicians or bureaucrats, but to anyone who believes that sacrifice and honor deserve to be remembered. This video exists because there are people who refuse to accept that heroes should be erased. Because there are researchers who dig through archives finding the stories that were deliberately buried. Because there are descendants of those soldiers who demand that their ancestors be honored. The 32 men who died on Monte Belvedere have names: Private João Silva from Bahia, who was 20 years old; Corporal André Martins from Minas Gerais, who had a wife and infant daughter; Sergeant Paulo Medeiros, called Lobo, who saved 3 men with his final act. They have names, they have stories. They deserve to be remembered not as statistics, but as individuals who made the ultimate sacrifice. And when you share this video, when you subscribe to this channel, when you comment below telling us where you're watching from, you're doing something profound. You're saying that these men mattered. You're saying that their courage will not be forgotten. You're saying that the truth is more important than comfortable lies. So we ask you now, from whatever city you're in, whatever state, whatever country, comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Tell us what you learned from Lieutenant Marcos Eduardo Vargas's story. Tell us if you think courage like this should be taught in schools, should be celebrated, should be passed down to the next generation. Subscribe to this channel if you believe that forgotten heroes deserve to have their stories told. Turn on notifications so you never miss another story of sacrifice that governments tried to erase. And share this video with someone who needs to understand that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary things when honor and duty demand it. Did this story move you? Did it change how you think about courage and leadership? Did it make you wonder what other heroes have been forgotten? Leave your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one, because this isn't just about history, it's about memory. It's about ensuring that when men like Marcos Eduardo Vargas do impossible things, the world remembers. And as long as people like you keep watching, keep sharing, keep refusing to forget, these heroes will never truly die. That's the truth no silence can kill.